Violence of any kind has a cost that impacts everything and is lasting. And gender-based violence is more common and far-reaching than most people care to imagine. The world should feel safe. Home should feel safe. But oftentimes for women, it neither feels safe nor is safe. Until then, we press for change, for justice, and paint the world orange, representing a bright and optimistic future free from violence against women and girls. On this episode of Shak, we have Patrice Daniel, who is a US-trained psychotherapist whose area of professional focus is the individual person within the sociocultural context. She's trained to view processes through a lens of gender, race, and power, and incorporate this analysis in a cross-cutting manner throughout. Patrice has a significant history of social justice work and has been a member and leader of several organizations that address social inequalities, marginalization, and discrimination. Her passion lies in advancing racial and gender justice and combating the violence committed against women and girls because of their gender. The impact of her work is felt nationally, regionally, and globally, and she has received notable accolades. Welcome, Patrice, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yes, we're excited to have you as well. I guess as a starting point, maybe we should define what is gender-based violence.
I think that's really important because most of the times when these conversations start, it becomes clear that people don't quite understand what gender-based violence is. And so then the conversation emanating is not quite hitting the mark. So I agree that that's a really important place to start. The key term is gender. And I've even conducted presentations and trainings called putting the gender in gender-based violence. So when you're thinking of gender-based violence, it's a specific type of violence. It's not just violence in general. It is violence committed on the basis of gender because of the gender of the victim or survivor. So in this case, a simplified version would be violence committed against women and girls because they're women and girls. So that violence is connected to their identities as women and girls. And this violence is deployed specifically to maintain a particular social structure. So this violence is used as a tool of oppression against women and girls. And there's also a gendered element, of course, in violence committed against members of the LGBTQ community. So I don't want to forget that. The idea that when people do not perform gender roles as prescribed by society, and that might be how people present in terms of their gender identity or who they love in terms of their sexual orientation, that the violence is deployed against them to make them conform to societal norms. So that's very important. We're not just talking about violence. We're talking about violence committed because of the identity the person holds. Most cases, women and girls.
Yeah, and I suppose sometimes people kind of use it interchangeably with domestic violence, which is not necessary, which is maybe like a category of gender-based violence.
Yeah, there are all the different parts that overlap and intersect. There's intimate partner violence, or you'll hear violence against women and girls as well, gender-based and sexual violence. The definitions are similar to each other and they overlap with each other, but they're not quite the same.
Okay. And I mean, of course, every time I have to say, oftentimes we have these discussions about violence against women and girls, and, people always ask about, what about violence against men? What do you usually say to those comments?
What do I usually say to those comments? Well, when those comments come up, I often think a lot about when the comments are coming up and why the comments are coming up. So comments that involve what about men often come up in a discussion about violence against women and girls. And these discussions tend to happen after a really horrific crime has been committed, after a perpetrator, an abuser, a killer, a rapist has killed or raped or in another way severely brutalized a woman. And the discussion is going on about violence against women and girls, and somebody pops up and says, so what about violence against men? If a person is not concerned about violence against men at any other time, than when a conversation about violence against women is taking place, and it makes me question their motives.
Okay.
Why are you bringing this up now? Is it that you're genuinely concerned, or is it that you're seeking to silence women? You're seeking to derail the conversation. It is a tactic to move the conversation from an uncomfortable reality and uncomfortable truth to something that, it might feel a little more comfortable. And also, we need to go back to just what we said at the beginning of this conversation. Violence against women is a specific type of gendered violence.
Yeah.
When violence is committed against men, it tends not to be gendered in that way. It's typically not committed because there are men in order to keep them in a subordinate position, which is the role and function of gender-based violence. It tends to be committed in connection with some other crime, maybe, I don't know, all the different crimes that can spawn violence, arms, drugs, etc., whatever can result in violence in a community. And also, many of the perpetrators of violence against men are other men.
Yes.
So that is not to say that violence against men is not an important topic. All violence is important. All violence needs to be discussed, eradicated, addressed as a priority in our society, but we need to not confuse the types of violence. And violence against women is a specific type used as a tool of oppression.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's always curious, the motive and the timing.
Fair enough.
That it comes up. Yeah.
So, I mean, how widespread would we say violence against women in the Caribbean? I follow your Facebook page, Walking Into Walls, and I have to say the volume of the news articles, even though I know it's widespread, is still staggering.
Yes. So Walking Into Walls, which you can find going back to 2012 up until the beginning of the pandemic, has been tracking only what's been reported in media. So that would tell you that still is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Stories involving the rapes, sexual assaults, murders, abuses of Caribbean women by rapists and perpetrators. And it is a lot. It is a lot. It is constant. In the years that Walking Into Walls was being updated, I don't think there was a day where a story could not be found. If a story was not posted, it's because I wasn't posting on the day, not that there weren't stories in the media.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about this, I always have a ton of statistics because this is my area. So I have statistics on the Caribbean and statistics on Latin America, the different Caribbean countries. But what really stood out to me is not just the statistics, but our lived experience, as in there isn't a single woman who does not know another woman or who has not herself had some type of gender-based violation, be it harassment from the time you're a little child and walk into the corner store, be it friends who have been pressured into sexual situations they don't want to be a part of, being groped in effect. It is prevalent. It is a part of our lived reality. So yes, we have, for the Caribbean and Latin American region, the statistics from the UN would say 1 in 4 have suffered at least one violent experience perpetrated by a partner, or 7 in 10 have suffered some type of physical or sexual violence at some point in their life, in general, not necessarily from a partner. But that's just to say that as shocking and jarring as the statistics are, and they are shocking and jarring, especially for our region, because we have one of the most sexually violent regions in the whole entire world.
Wow.
So yeah. Our Caribbean region has some shocking statistics, and moving past the statistics, that's us, that's our lives, that's what it feels like to live in the Caribbean every day. So our lives reflect what UN Women statistics tell us, and the fact that we have a high incidence of cruelty in our violence. We have more types of violence like strangulation and dismemberment, gang rapes, and underage victims.
Wow.
So unfortunately, what is on the paper is reflected in how we live daily.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I was reading a post on Twitter recently, and the woman was actually saying, every woman that has, and even taken a longer route, pretended to be doing something, pretended
Oh,
to be
yes,
taking a phone
definitely.
call. So it's not only the actual violence, but it is the fear of violence.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
So as you had mentioned earlier, the gender-based violence statistics reflect our lived experience and the experience of so many women. So I was just wondering if there are any experiences you would like to share, if is there anything you want to say, about maybe something that's happened to you, because sometimes people are so removed from this or seem to be removed. So I just wonder if there's anything you want to share.
Yeah, you're right that when people hear the statistics, they could seem so far away and they don't recognize or realize sometimes that this is the lived experience of Caribbean women. So,
yeah.
For example, one day I had been out liming with friends and I'd had a really good time. It was a nice lime. I came home all in my head, laughing to myself, thinking about having fun. And I went to take a shower. And it was just such a mindless shower, the usual, thinking about all different things. And then all of a sudden, I heard this sound outside. I wasn't paying much attention to it, but then it became more persistent.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I moved the shower curtain to look back, I realized that a man had come onto my property and was attempting to watch me in the shower.
Oh my God.
So, of course, yeah. So, of course, I screamed. I was in the shower in a great state of vulnerability. I had to try to wash off, thinking all sorts of thoughts and try to get into some piece of clothing and alert the other people in my family and call the police and all of that. And the thing about it is that showering from then until now is a production, as in is not something that I simply do anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I always feel surveilled. I always think about what could possibly happen. I don't ever like to shower when I'm home alone.
Mm-hmm.
So I always have to feel like someone is there with me, a family member is there with me, or even at night, I'll make sure to close the windows, or if I open the windows because it's a warm night, I will turn on the light or use just a dim light from my cell phone. So it shows that something like that is something that I have carried with me for years now. Yep. And it impacts my life. And I'm not unique. This is something that has happened to many Caribbean women. And it's not the first or the last time that happened on my property, because another time I was at home a Sunday, reclining, chilling, playing on my phone, and I heard a voice, and it was a man that had come onto my property, come to my windows, and was looking under me and commenting on my privates and saying what he saw. So I jumped up and screamed, and police were called and all that. So
that is just crazy.
Yes. It was horrific. And what stands out to me about those two instances is that we as women are always policed by society. Whenever we talk about these things, the question is, where were you and what were you wearing and what were you doing? But I was in my house.
Yes.
This is the place where I'm supposed to feel most safe.
Correct.
And men took it upon themselves to come off of the road and onto my property to violate me. Yeah. And that is what it's like to live as a Caribbean woman. And I mean, I've been exercising on mornings with my mother when we go walking or running on the highway, the bright highway on the morning. And we have come upon a man in the bushes, and he's masturbating and he's watching women as they're exercising. And he is well enough known that this is a fairly common feature of the community, as in when this has been reported, people knew he was known. And these men are men from our communities, raised in Barbados, socialized by us. They have friends, they have families, they have jobs. In fact, I later found out that one of the men that had come onto my property to look at me through the window and say those vile, heinous things had spoken very politely to my neighbor while he was making his way onto my property. So it's all around. And it reminds me of when we talk about racism, for example, we as Black people experience countless acts of racism, but magically there are no racist white people.
Yeah.
Like no one is taking responsibility for it, but we're experiencing racism every day. And in the same way with sexism and misogyny, everyone would swear up and down that neither they or anyone in their circle would violate a woman in this way. Yet magically, these rapes and sexual violations are prominent in the lives of Caribbean women. So I think we really need to reckon with who we are as a people.
That is true. And as you said, I mean, women either experience it or they know other women, but sometimes I still wonder if people are aware of the prevalence of gender-based violence, or is it that they're not aware, or is it that they don't necessarily categorize something, maybe they don't attach it to that category?
I think people are aware, but maybe how we live our lives has become so normalized to involve or incorporate trying to protect ourselves from violence that we don't even think about what we're doing.
Yes.
So it has become so normal to ask someone to walk us to the car as women. Yes. That we're not really thinking that this means that we live in an environment that is so potentially dangerous to women, where rape is essentially a crime of opportunity. Yeah. That we are not going anywhere by ourselves. So even in automatically doing that, it suggests that we do have an awareness, but we've been doing it for so long that we might not even stop to think, hey, this is what that means, that I'm taking a longer route, or I am avoiding going to this corner shop as a little girl because the men outside are going to be there making comments. So, yeah.
Yep, that's true. What would you say? I mean, maybe you alluded to it a bit at the beginning, but what fuels the violence against women? I mean, is it impacted by traditional gender roles? I mean, as you said, it's not only, just a manifestation of gender inequality, but also maybe a way of enforcing it. So I'm just curious as like what fuels this?
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that, what you're saying about enforcing inequalities, enforcing differences in power. And it also makes me think of, because they're very similar in some ways, different in some, but similar in some, about crimes that are racist crimes that are committed on the basis of race. So we know that when we're talking about hate crimes that are committed against Black people, for example, it is not just a crime. It is a crime to reinforce a dynamic of power that white people are at the top of the society, and that's for people who believe in white supremacy. So they would think that white people are at the top of the society and Black people are at the bottom of the social order. Yeah. So when Black people become too uppity, then you see a crime to put them back in their place. So these sorts of crimes that are based on the idea that certain groups are the ones that are supposed to have power and hold power and access it, and certain groups like LGBTQ people, women, Black people, Indigenous people, other racial minorities and other racially marginalized people are supposed to hold their place. And so these crimes are deployed as a tool to reinforce that social power dynamic. So gender-based violence is no different. When I used to update Walking Into Walls before the pandemic, when you look within the stories, I swear, Akeelia, it used to be like reading a textbook. The kind of reasons that people would give for committing these sorts of gender-based abuses. Yeah, it used to be when women were not fulfilling their gender role in their mind of taking care of the home, or if a woman had been accused, often not credibly, of cheating, which how dare she step out of her prescribed gender role? How dare she make me look bad as a partner, right? Yeah. So these forms of violence were employed to put her back in her place, to literally beat her back into submission where she belongs. So we definitely have to employ that framework when looking at gender-based violence.
Or some of the myths you would think that surround gender-based violence?
Well, let's see. The word myth, there was this article that I read once and it really, really stayed with me. is called The Myth of the Monster Rapist. And it was written by a man whose wife had been raped and killed. And he was in court with the perpetrator, right?
Yeah.
And he spoke about the judge asking the perpetrator a question, well, the accused in this instant, because it was during the trial, asking the accused a question. And the fact that the man answered normal in coherent tones, and he realized that in his mind, he had created a monster in his mind, that the person who is accused of committing such a horrific crime had to be monstrous.
Yeah.
So we have this idea. And so he was so shocked to hear the man say a simple sentence. But then he realized that it was based on that idea that we have, that people who commit these crimes are these monstrous outliers in society, and they aren't. There are people in our society, socialized in our society, learning all the things we learn, along with learning all of the harmful gender stereotypes, and then they enact them. And so often when women speak up about their experiences, you'll hear people say, but he was such a nice guy.
Oh, yes.
He was real polite and sweet. Yeah, he's not going to be a troll or an ogre.
Yeah.
It is one of us. These, as they say, they walk among us. So one myth is the myth of the monster rapist. Another one that gets me, especially as a mental health clinician, is the idea, I guess it's connected to the monster rapist myth because it's a way of othering and making the person exceptional, is that the person must have been mentally ill in that they lost control and they didn't know what they were doing. And that is also not at all accurate. Many perpetrators know exactly what they're doing. And I can tell you from walking into walls, I would post stories that involved a significant degree of premeditation. People who stood calmly in the line at the hardware store to buy rope, to buy poison, to buy implements, who hid in bushes for hours to commit that crime. So it's not a case where this person doesn't, that they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah. The other thing in terms of myths, I often wonder if people think that it affects maybe a particular socioeconomic class, that is not, it's particular, maybe, which is also tied to the point you were making, but that is a particular type of individual, who not necessarily the person who looks very polished or runs a business or that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely that is an idea that gender-based violence only affects poor people, basically. The idea that it affects poor people. But if we think of it in terms of power and prescribed gender roles, we know that goes across all socioeconomic positions and placements. So, and even, like in watching TV, light TV, and in terms of certain TV shows that would show stereotypes of upper classness, you know what I mean? Like certain movies and whatnot that would show those stereotypes. The gender dynamics are very much there.
Yeah.
So you still see, regardless of the socioeconomic status that a person occupies, the gender roles might look a little different, but the dynamics are still there. There is an equal access to power. There's a perception about what a woman should do, what a man should do, who should be in charge, and all of those feed into gender-based violence. And as long as you have that in the dynamic, then violence is possible to reinforce it, whether it's a poor person, is a rich person, whoever.
We talk a lot about this being developed in the society that we live in. Culture shapes, our lives, our identity, our beliefs. Would you say in the Caribbean that there is a culture of silence and a culture of violence, really?
Well, a culture of violence. Well, we know the Caribbean was born in blood.
Yes.
Absolutely. The Caribbean was born in blood. Barbados being one of the first, or the first slave society in the world. Obviously not the first one to have slavery, but the first one where the entire economic system is one that is dependent on the enslavement of Black Africans. So we have a horrific honor of being the first slave society in the world. As Professor Beckles would say, Barbados is the incubator. The greatest experiment in human terror in the Western world first took place in Barbados. So if we are born of blood and our society has come from using your membership of a social group to wield power over another group, it doesn't surprise me that there's elements of that still running throughout our culture, whether it is racism and white supremacy, whether it is based on gender, but very much in our founding that we have to reckon with is that we came out of, we were birthed of, we were created in a crucible of using power and force to do harm to people in another group and to keep them down.
Yeah.
So in considering gender-based violence, especially in the Caribbean, we cannot ignore our colonial history, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And as for the culture of silence, well, I would say that people speak up. Our people are more likely to speak up or less likely, depending on the sort of reception they think they're going to get. So when a young girl or a woman comes and talks about experiencing sexual violence, how do we as a community respond?
Yeah.
You know, is it that we create a safe space? Do we believe her? Or do we question her and blame her and shame her and talk about her skirt, the length of her skirts, or the tightness of a child's uniform? Or if a police report is made, are you going to be asked what you were doing walking in that area, which, by the way, is not the crime.
Yes.
Walking is, you know, just normal. So that, I think, influences victims and survivors and their willingness to speak out. How will they be received? Are you just going to be dragged over the coals for nothing to happen?
Yeah. You know, you talk about, you know, how the society responds and that kind of thing. But I was wondering, what would you say are the wider implications of gender-based violence? Because it doesn't just impact the victims or their families. It tends to be a bit far-reaching.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And we alluded to it a bit at the beginning of the conversation when we talked about women and girls, especially having to arrange their lives around safety.
Yes.
And that kind of limiting, that kind of boundary around their potential or just around their movement. Imagine what life would be like if women didn't have to do that. Women and girls. And like I said, gendered violence also affects members of the LGBT community. Things like staying late in the office. So how is the constant threat of violence affecting women and their productivity if they know that they need to be out of the office by a certain time? If there's fear around staying late in the office, staying late with a particular coworker, staying late with a guard or a security personnel that's supposed to be helpful, but that may in fact be the problem.
Yes.
Even things like our conversations about chronic non-communicable diseases and obesity and diabetes and hypertension. What would it be like if women could really exercise at any time?
Yeah.
And how that would affect their health for the better. So is these different ways that violence or the constant threat of violence limits potential.
Yeah.
And these are the ones that we don't really think about as much. We do think more about how gender-based violence affects workers in the workplace, because sometimes women will come to work battered, or they may have to miss work, or they might have to, or they might not be able to perform up to the standard that they want to.
Yeah.
Or they might lose jobs if perpetrators come to the office to make a scene. So that's a wider social impact. And there tends to be some conversation about that, yes, with labor legislation and labor rights. And I don't think people really think about what is lost, like the potential of what a life could look like, these sort of leisure activities that women and girls could enjoy.
Yeah.
Without the threat of violence, I would be at, well, not no, because, you know, there's a pandemic,
COVID.
but I would be at Farley Hill at midnight all the time, because I could just look at the stars, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess there's also the financial cost. I mean, there's not just to the victim. I mean, I mean, in terms of taxpaying dollars, people have to go to the
Yes.
hospital, and run on resources
Yeah, for
to
sure.
manage. Yeah. Even though I think we can answer this question, I was going to ask about the correlation between violence against women and violence against children. I'm just wondering if there is if there's a correlation, not only, I guess, girls, but just in general.
Yeah, well, when we were talking about how a society views violence, right? So if a society is the type to use violence as a tool of enforcement of social order, and so if children are considered to be lesser in the social order, then they would be appropriate, and I mean by appropriate, not actual appropriate, but appropriate targets for violence. Because as far as that thought process is concerned, that is the way to keep people in their place. That is a tool of correction. And so the same way, or in a similar way, that it would be visited upon women and girls, also children. Another connection that people often may not think about is that children are often used as tools to commit violence against women and girls. That is to say that perpetrators, who may sometimes be the father of the children, can use the children to control the partner, can use the children to threaten the partner. I've even posted stories where fathers of children have killed the children in the most gruesome and grotesque ways in order to inflict pain and harm. So that desire, or that insistence on controlling the wife, the girlfriend, the partner, it predominates thinking. And there's a willingness to sacrifice children to get her attention, to cause pain, to cause harm. I remember posting a story, and after this father had killed his daughter, he called the mother of the daughter, which would have been his ex-girlfriend, and said, "Do I have your attention?" "No."
Whoa.
So, and it had been a horrific murder, a truly horrific murder of that little girl. So that is a connection that is worth underscoring. There's a general view of children as appropriate for violence, because we need to keep them in their place, but also how they are pulled into gendered violence situations and used as pawns and ways to threaten and to hurt mothers, because that's one way to get her attention, for sure, is through the child.
Certainly this is a significant problem, but I'm thinking about what are some of the initiatives that are being, I guess we talked a lot about the problem, but what are some of these significant initiatives being undertaken to kind of help eradicate gender-based violence?
Well, these start from the ground and go up. So you have the grassroots organizations, and thinking about taking a regional perspective on it. In all the different countries, you have grassroots organizations doing so much work. They're the ones that are responsible for marching to bring awareness to the problem. They're the ones responsible for running the shelters, the kind of work that sometimes goes on in the background that we're not even thinking about. Like as we sit and speak right now, there are women in shelters, and shelters that tend to be underfunded and underappreciated.
Yes.
And that is happening right now in Barbados, in other countries across the Caribbean. Then there are activists working at the level of legislation. So trying to change legislation to criminalize some activities or to increase penalties for other activities. And there was recently a project called the Jurist Project, and it was examining courtrooms through a lens of making them safer and friendlier towards victims of sexual and gender-based violence. And then like sexual offenses model courts. There are people intervening in all different spaces, be it the legal space, be it providing direct services. It could be going out and doing education and awareness building. And then up on the larger government level, there's this program called the Spotlight Initiative. And that is a collaboration between the European Union and UN Women. And that is a big program that's spanning the Caribbean. So it's UN Women, the Caribbean governments, the European Union, and they're coming together to expand and fund and build capacity and intervene in all these different ways to continue to put a spotlight, as the name suggests, on violence against women and girls, and work with the women's movements and the civil society and all that to try to eradicate it.
Okay. That sounds positive, and I applaud people doing this kind of work. I'm just wondering if, from your perspective, there's anything in particular you would like to see more of, in terms of enacting change. Maybe a gap.
Well, I always say that the only thing that could prevent gender-based violence is perpetrators not committing it. So we can do the education, we can provide the services as necessary, and we can tighten legislation, we can provide shelters. But what will change the incidence of gender-based violence is perpetrators deciding not to commit it in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's where the intervention would be for me, especially because, my focus is the individual as well. So that creating a culture, and this is so broad, but creating a culture where gender-based violence is taboo. So there's cultural messaging and messaging to individual people that this is just not how we live.
Yeah.
So the same way that there is messaging now that supports gender-based violence and that perpetuates it, that keeps it going, there's messaging in our music, messaging in our media, messaging all over that reinforces gender inequalities and whatnot. Whatever is the opposite to that would be my perfect world.
Fair enough.
Where we send messages that we just don't do this. We're not out here raping little girls, and we're not out here killing women. We're not out here trafficking or creating child brides or committing acid attacks. That should be our messaging from childhood coming up. Like, this is just unacceptable.
Yeah. Okay, I agree. Because it starts with the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess you mentioned, all the work in the legal space. And one thing I wanted to ask about was what your views are on a sexual offender registry. Is that something that you think is useful or relevant in our Caribbean context, or not really?
Yeah, I think it could be useful and relevant, especially depending on how it is used. So if people are convicted of a sexual crime and it's a matter of public record, and that is aggregated or disaggregated, like pulled out and then put together then. So pulled out of the general data and put together in a space that is easily accessible to the relevant parties. So if it is police officers that can access it, whether or not it would be accessible to the general public. Yeah, I think that's a bit more tricky. And I'd be curious just in general about the laws around that. Like, are all convictions accessible to the general public already as it is? I'm really not certain.
Okay.
If all are. But just the idea of pulling out that data and having it accessible to the parties to whom it makes a difference, relevant, like put together in one central space and accessible to those who can use it in the best way possible for the society, that makes sense to me.
Okay. So lastly then, what do you think we each can do? How can we each play our part to eradicate gender-based violence? It is not women perpetuating this violence, but I'm still curious as to, how do we help?
So many different thoughts going through my mind at once. That's why I took a big pause, like, what can we do? Well,
and I mean, I'm still reflecting on the question, because maybe it's better focus on how we can support people who may be experiencing that. I'm not sure that at the individual level we can eradicate it, because we are usually the victims of that. Yeah. And I don't want to, and I don't want to, make it seem like it is our responsibility to correct somebody's problem.
No, I definitely didn't say that from the question. I agree with what you're saying completely. That is not up to people who tend to be victims and survivors of the violence to eradicate it for sure. But speaking generally as a society, talk to your friends. So that would be, yeah, talk to your friends, especially men and boys. Talk to your friends. When you hear your friends make certain comments, make certain jokes that push a narrative, that violations of women are funny or fun, or that they don't really matter, or, you know, ain't a big deal. He just grabbed she behind her, you know, when you hear that sort of rhetoric in the spaces to which you have access, instead of dismissing it as locker room talk or boys will be boys, that's the point of intervention. A lot of men, when these conversations come up, like to jump in and say, not all men.
Yeah.
So not all men might be committing violence, but a significant number play a role in perpetuating it. If you understand what I mean, that you might not be actually committing it, but are you interrupting conversations that make light of it? Are you calling out your brethren and saying, nah, that ain't it, chief? Like, that is not it. So if you really want to be in the category of not all men, and I'm sure you can tell from my tone how I feel about that hashtag, if you really want to be in the category of a good guy, again, in quotes, then do the good thing, right?
Yeah.
Interrupt the conversation wherever it comes up around you. And if we can have that, that should snowball through the culture.
Okay, fair enough. So thank you, Patrice, for chatting with me today. I have to say, I am so proud of the work that you do, you know, for giving voice to what is really a human rights crisis.
Thank you.
Women deserve to be safe, and we deserve a future free from fear.
Yes, agreed. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to join us every other Wednesday for another episode of Shak. Subscribe to our podcast using your favorite podcast platform. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can also connect with us on IG, Facebook, and Twitter, or by email at akilia@shakshak.club. Let's shake things up.